Some people dedicate their entire lives to a special cause. This woman adopted a wild elephant to save its life. Years later, something unbelievable happened. Daphne loved the smell of the bush. She hadn't been back in a while, and it felt like a homecoming. She sat in the shade inside a safari vehicle. Then, she heard the steps that she had been waiting for. A massive herd of elephants came past in the distance. It was incredible to see them. She had to wipe the tears running down her face. It was like looking at family members she hadn't seen in a long time. She was an old woman now, but the sense of achievement that she felt when looking at those beautiful animals was next to nothing. She had built her entire life trying to take care of these amazing giants. Now, she was at the end of her life, and she wanted to see them one more time, but no one could have ever predicted what would happen next. Daphne Jenkins was born in a city in Kenya. Her parents were British, and the country was still a British colony. They had a large farm, but during the Second World War, her dad worked on a game reserve. She went to visit him, and that was when she found her life's calling. She remembered, even at the young age of only 6, that she hoped that she could one day live among the animals and the massive sky. But few of us grow up to build the life we had dreamt of when we were small. But it looked like Daphne's path always led her back to animals and their care. She grew up and met her first husband, Bill Woodley. He turned out to work in a few different game reserves in Kenya to battle against poachers, which was a massive issue even then. This relationship introduced her to animal conservation. The marriage didn't last, but her passion for helping animals did. And eventually, she married David Sheldrick, who was a warden of one of Kenya's biggest national parks. Even before they got married, he showed her that he was as passionate about animals as his new wife was. It was one of the things that brought them together. They did everything they could to help the animals they were in charge of caring for. That meant fighting off poachers as much as they could and putting safety features in place. Sadly, it also meant that they would take care of orphaned animals like young elephants and rhinos. But although these were the main animals they cared for, any baby animal that needed help was welcomed. They had everything from zebras to both big and small antelope, birds, and everything in between. When adopting these animals, they always had the goal of releasing them back into the wild. But that wasn't always possible. Many of these babies were still young enough that they needed to be bottle-fed. Of course, you can't exactly go to your nearest grocery store to ask for elephant milk formula. This was in the late 50s to the late 70s in Kenya, and there weren't as many tested formulas available for animal care as there are now. Daphne had to figure things out on her own. She began experimenting with a mix of milk formulas that she developed herself. Large animals like baby elephants and rhinos need a lot more nourishment than traditional formulas provide. Giving them regular milk or formula normally meant that they quickly became malnourished and that they could lose them. It was only when she realized that a formula containing coconut oil contained enough fat to work for these babies that they started saving a lot more of them. The couple became the first call for other game parks to call when they had animals that were in trouble. They became a formidable team in the animal rescue field. But sadly, Daphne would face a massive tragedy very soon. After 17 years of marriage and saving animals together, she lost her husband Bill when he was only 57. It was a blow, but Daphne was determined to make him proud and honor his commitment to conservation. With her daughter Jill, they kept working to look after baby rhinos and elephants, and the wildlife trust that grew out of these efforts was remarkable. Today, it is called the Sheldrick Wildlife Trust, and it is currently the most successful orphan elephant rescue and rehabilitation program in the world. It has now grown to a huge endeavor that works with anti-poaching teams and mobile vets that help animals who have already been impacted. They also do aerial surveillance to keep elephants and rhinos safe from these poachers who have no conscience and seemingly no heart. But back then, it was mainly Daphne working on taking on baby elephants that needed to be cared for and help them back into the wild if they could be. The trust has now rescued over 262 baby elephants, and from those, they could restore 160 of them back to the wild. Many of those animals were personally raised by Daphne, but a few would stand out as special. For example, there was one that came into her life just after she lost her husband. At the time, Daphne was doing everything just to move forward and get up each day. Then, she got the phone call. A nearby national park had an orphaned elephant that needed her help. They didn't want to phone her while she was grieving, but this baby elephant was in bad shape and she was getting worse with each day. Happy for the distraction, Daphne left at once to go and get the little girl. It was a bad situation. From the tracks, some of the skilled trackers could figure out what had happened. The baby elephant was only a few days old, and her mother was still weakened from the birth when the poachers attacked. Elephants in a herd are very protective of each other, and it seemed like the herd tried to protect the mom and her baby, but the poachers shot at them randomly, not caring how many elephants they injured. The herd scattered, and the poachers shot at the mom. They hit the baby elephant in her shoulder too because she was trying to hide under her mama. The poachers moved in and didn't care about the baby elephant. When the rangers arrived, she was lying next to her mom, whose tusks had been removed. It was too late for the mom, but the small elephant was alive. It broke their hearts because the baby elephant didn't want to leave her mom. She even had tears in her eyes. Elephants have complex emotions, and every single elephant they lost broke their hearts. They wanted to save the small elephant. They cared for her wounds, and luckily it was mostly a flesh wound. But the wounds in her heart were harder to care for. It looked like the baby elephant was depressed. She didn't want to eat, and they were worried that they were going to lose her. It was terrible. They had no other choice but to call Daphne. Upon arriving, Daphne could discern the same anguish reflected in the elephant's eyes that she felt within herself. Driven by determination to assist the animal, she hoped that in doing so, she might find solace too. Daphne devoted every moment of her day to the baby elephant's care. She often offered her the milk bottle, and for a while, the elephant kept refusing it. Physical contact seemed to bring her some comfort, and Daphne kept wiping her down and cuddling with her. The elephant just wanted to be held. She needed as much love as they could give her. She was traumatized by losing her mom and how it happened, and she needed time. By the second day, she started taking small sips of the milk formula. By day 3, she started drinking, but she still didn't want to play. She was sad, and it would take time. Daphne was willing to give her all the time she needed. When seeking comfort, the young elephant would approach where Daphne sat, and they would touch foreheads. It was like she was asking for cuddles. The woman was always happy to supply them. It was a remarkable feeling to mother a wild animal. The small elephant had a scar on her shoulder from the bullet wound. It looked like a rose, and that's what they called her. Rose was very attached to Daphne, but she was still a wild elephant, and they only stepped in to save her life. They wanted her to have a life in the wild if she could. It was time to start getting her ready to be released. Daphne became less hands-on. This was hard because she had built a special bond with Rose. They came into each other's lives when they both needed it. But it was what was best for Rose, and that was always the priority. They then started looking at opportunities for the elephant to be released. There was a herd that had many of Daphne's rescue elephants in it, and they had proven very welcoming to orphans. Most herds would adopt a baby elephant on their own. This herd seemed like their best shot. Rose was old enough to start eating regular food, and she didn't need milk anymore. But she was still young enough to be accepted into the herd. This herd had a good track record, but it was still scary, leaving the small elephant to go to them on her own. These were wild animals, and they could quickly injure the elephant without them being able to help her. Daphne was worried about little Rose. It would be devastating if something went wrong now. Rose stood around checking out the area when the matriarch of the herd came over to check her out. It looked like the little elephant got a fright seeing such a massive animal in front of her. She was not used to seeing her own kind. and she was even less used to them being as large as this massive African elephant. But the female was very gentle with Rose, and she gently used her trunk to direct the small elephant toward the group. Everything was going remarkably well, and a few days later, they checked in on them again from a distance. If they didn't know any different, it would have seemed like Rose had always been part of the herd. It was bittersweet. Daphne would never have that feeling of an elephant placing her forehead on her own again. She went on to rescue many other wild animals and care for many elephants. But that was one thing that only Rose ever did. As time passed, Daphne found herself unable to maintain her usual level of activity. Her daughter assumed many of her responsibilities, yet, despite reduced workload, Daphne remained perpetually exhausted. She quipped about this being the onset of old age, a concept foreign to someone who had never grasped the notion of stopping. Her family begged her to be checked out by a doctor. When she finally did, they discovered something heartbreaking. It was breast cancer. Daphne would have to leave her beloved animals to go back to England for specialized treatment. She fought with everything she had. She fought the disease as hard as she had ever battled against the poachers in Africa. But sadly, this illness was just as relentless as those heartless monsters. Eventually, doctors had to give her the news that they all feared. There was nothing more that they could do. Daphne only had one thought. It was time to go home. She wanted to be in Kenya, the place she loved most in the world, surrounded by her family and close to the animals that were her life. She was in her 80s at that stage, but despite her illness, she still had the same spirit. She knew that she would soon be too sick to travel out to the national parks, and that was the first thing she wanted to do when she got home. She wanted to see one of the herds that she had helped to save and create. They used a safari vehicle and parked in the shade of a thorn tree. It wasn't long before the elephant herd came past. Daphne wiped the tears running down her face while watching them. She had lived a life that she could be proud of. She had helped to save some of the most magnificent creatures on earth, and she had achieved a lot. It was remarkable. Then, she saw something that shocked her. An elephant with a rose-shaped scar on her shoulder. The baby elephant she once saved was still living in this herd. She explained that she had adopted the wild elephant to save its life. Now, it was years later. Then, something unbelievable happened. Typically, animals perceive a vehicle as a single entity, making it safer to remain inside. However, this instinct might not hold true for those raised among humans and vehicles. Rose appeared to notice them, prompting the now massive animal to separate from the group. She came straight towards the vehicle. The guide started getting nervous. With her daughter's help, Daphne got out of the car. The guide pleaded with them to get back in, but the old woman stood confident and assured him that this animal could never hurt her. Rose looked straight at Daphne, and then the elephant did something incredible. As she approached the car, she lowered her head down until she could place her forehead against Daphne's. It had been years, but the animal remembered her adoptive mother. It was a moment that left everyone in tears. The bond and love between the woman and the elephant could be felt by everyone present. This was a massive creature that could crush her with one step. Instead, she was allowing the old lady to hug her huge trunk. It seemed as though she was expressing gratitude to Daphne for rescuing her. It even felt like she was thanking Daphne for all the efforts made in saving many others over the years. Yet, above all, to Daphne, it felt like a final farewell. They stood like that for a while, and then Rose turned around and went back to her family. The herd moved away, and Daphne signaled that they could go back. She had achieved what she had come for. It would be the last time she was in the African bush. Not long after, at 83, Daphne lost her battle with cancer. She would no longer be there to fight for animals, but the impact that she had on them would remain. There were many people who would continue the work that she and her beloved David had started. She could finally rest, knowing that the animals were in good hands. Even now, there are still horrible people poaching African elephants for their tusks, but institutions like the Sheldrick Wildlife Trust keep fighting against them, just like Daphne would have wanted. What an incredible story! Thanks for watching. Join us again for even more incredible stories.